Story 1. An acquaintance of mine was a medical resident on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The hospitals went into emergency triage mode, preparing for an onslaught of injured survivors, thinking there would be a huge overflow from closer hospitals. And it was just silent. There were no survivors sent their way. That's when she realized the unprecedented devastation of the attack. Story 2. Coming home and watching my mom try to explain to my 7-year-old little brothers that what had happened had nothing to do with the fact that it was still their birthday. Dad was grounded halfway across the country on a business trip. We spent half the day trying to get a hold of our aunt who was actively working in the Pentagon, and they were too young to fully grasp why everyone around them was panicking. Mom unplugged all of the TVs, and we had dinner and cake as if nothing had happened. Her grace and composure kept an already horrible day from consuming our reason to celebrate. Even today, our family holds the mentality that it was their day first. We can remember with the rest of the country, but it is still first and foremost their birthday to be celebrated. Story 3. The hours before I knew if my mom was dead or alive were agonizing. They wouldn't let us leave the school, and I didn't have a phone. From our school, we could look out the window and see the smoke. Some people saw the second hit. Finally, they couldn't hold us any longer, and I ran home. Mom was asleep and didn't even know what had happened. She had taken me to school, then decided she was going to take the day off, went home to nap, and just slept all day. Story 4. My dad was a bartender in Fairfield County, Connecticut, near a train station, and said the cars left there in the parking lot were sad. Then some of his regulars stopped showing up. Eventually, he found out they were gone. Story 5. My high school was on the flight path for an Air Force base. Hearing the entire squadron of fighter jets take off in quick succession in a way that they had never done before, and not knowing why, was absolutely unnerving. Story 6. When I found out that my roommate's dad died in the second tower, it was heart-wrenching. He had gone down to the sky deck after the first plane hit, but they gave the all clear, so he went back up to his office thinking he would be okay. He believed he was safe because he was there in 1993 during the car bomb attack in the garage. Then, the second plane hit, trapping him. Story 7. When the first tower fell, the feeling of absolute dread and horror, knowing how many lives were ending at that moment, was overwhelming. The second one falling just felt like the end of the world, and in many ways it was. The world we lived in changed dramatically and immediately. Story 8. Seeing all of the people jump from the flaming towers was a distressing sight. It was sanitized from most replays, but when the event was being shown live, you could see one person after another jump. Some would jump 5 or 6 people at a time. You could see holes in the roof of a pavilion where the bodies tore through. And you could see the results on the ground, although identifying them as human was impossible. The thought of what those people must have been facing inside the towers, that made jumping to their deaths the better option, was horrifying. Story 9. For me, the worst was thinking I had just lost both my parents in a 6-month period. My mom died in the spring of 2001. My dad was at the Pentagon. I was a sophomore in high school and spent the day wondering who I was going to live with, how I was going to keep our house, how I was going to pay for food, etc. All punctuated by new and increasingly horrific images and news updates. I barely remember that day, other than sitting with my classmates in each subsequent period, staring at the TV and talking in small groups. A lot of people at the school had family that lived or worked in the district, so we were all more than a little freaked out. Most of that day is a foggy haze to me. My brain was just overwhelmed with the enormity of it all and my own personal shock. My dad was fine in the end, but I didn't know until I got home from school and checked the answering machine and heard his voice. I think I cried a little with relief. Story 10. I was living in Okinawa when it happened, and immediately the base shut down and sirens went crazy. They had to prepare as if the attack was from North Korea and act accordingly. It was in the middle of the night, and I was around 11, so it was super weird. Story 11. I lost my sister-in-law in the North Tower, 96th floor, Susan Ruggiero. It was horrible. We never forgot that day. The loss of one life affects so many. Story 12. For me, it was that I just got home from Army training late on September 9th and was really looking forward to relaxing with my girlfriend for the 2 days I had before classes started at the university. I hadn't even unpacked my gear yet. I turned the television on, watched the second plane hit, and my heart sank when my phone rang soon afterward. By the end of the day, I was saying goodbye to my friends and family again. Story 13. My dad's name. I can't reach either of them. I can't. My aunt broke down sobbing around 9 p.m. because no one could reach my two family members in the New York Police Department. My uncle called around midnight to say he was okay. My dad's cousin the following afternoon. They had both been assisting with the evacuations around the city. Story 14. When the number of firefighters lost was announced that night, it was just an overwhelming moment on top of a brutal day. 343 that day, more than 700 in total. Heartbreaking. Story 15. School didn't allow us to watch, and teachers were told not to tell us much. By noon, we thought every city had been attacked. Kids were being pulled out every few minutes with a crying parent walking them out. I think we ended up leaving early, but I can't remember fully. However, I do remember traffic being held up so our town and the 3 nearby could convoy nearly all fire trucks to the city to help. Going home, you could see everything burning on the skyline. It wasn't until I got home to my mom on the phone crying that I turned on the TV to see footage of the second plane hitting. Pick any one of those. It was a bad day. Story 16. My father was an airline pilot for United Airlines, and he flew transcontinental from New York City to Boston on a regular basis. I was away at college and had no idea where he was until the afternoon. He ended up being in Denver for almost a week, but he knew quite a few of the crew members that died that day. He keeps a plaque with all of their names in his office. Secondly, the people jumping and those hanging out of the windows to breathe have deeply affected me. I feel like they fundamentally changed me as a person. The thought of people just going to work and then having to decide to die is profoundly disturbing. I still get very anxious in tall buildings and confined spaces. Story 17. The fear of not knowing what was going on was prevalent. Back then, we didn't have platforms like Twitter or Reddit to instantly share information the moment it happened. Yet, even on the first day the attacks occurred, the amount of misinformation spreading in the community was significant. I remember my school bus driver that afternoon trying to convince us all that there were terrorist planes still in the air and that we could be in danger. Later on, one of the most harrowing moments was when audio began to spread on the internet of some people's final moments that day. There is a horrific video, still easily found on YouTube, capturing the audio of a man stuck in one of the towers, speaking with a news station over the phone when the tower he was in started to collapse. You can hear people screaming in the background. The man screams, "Oh God!" And within a second, there's silence as the line cuts off. The realization that these people, in that moment, were all violently crushed into nothingness was sickening. Story 18. I was 9 years old when the teachers ran into each other's classrooms in a panic, telling each other to turn on the news. I remember seeing the footage and wondering what the little falling dots were. And then we realized they were people. Felt like my brain broke. I didn't understand and kept asking, why? I couldn't fathom making the choice to get crushed or burned to death or to fall to death. I think I was too young to feel intense feelings because I truly didn't understand. Now, I have to fight tears every time I think about it. This is horrifying. Story 19. The worst part is it just kept happening. We were glued to our TVs, watching all this turmoil unfold, and trying not to become numb to it. Everything just kept piling on, one event after another, non-stop. Even the next day, there were fires, buildings collapsing, and the most eerie part, they didn't find bodies for days. The rubble had reduced them to nothing. Story 20. I am Australian. When this happened, I was in my early 30s. It happened late at night our time, but we had actually gone to bed so didn't know until the alarm went off at 5 a.m. We were dumbfounded. It was just so incredibly awful that it was hard to comprehend. We went to work, but not a lot of work got done that day. Everyone was just crowded around a TV in shock. And I will never forget seeing all those people jumping and falling. It just made me feel so sick to the pit of my stomach. Having been up to the top in 1995 when I traveled in the USA, I can remember looking down and seeing the cars like specks, and people were falling from that height. Sickening. The world changed forever that day. Pre-September 11 versus post-September 11. Story 21. At the end of the day, people running around Manhattan with photos of their family members, showing them or posting them on fences. Completely irrational when you think about it, but the trauma and the desperation are profound. Story 22. The grim sense of foreboding. It's like we all collectively knew in that moment that life would never be the same again. The world we knew was gone, and the world ahead was one of uncertainty. I hate how right we all were. I've always said that September 11th murdered the optimism of the future that the 90s held. Story 23. When the news started learning of Flight 93, they were reporting that they heard a plane had gone down in Pennsylvania, and they were not sure if it was involved in the attack. Then you find out it was. It was the most overwhelming moment for me because when is this going to end? And as someone living in the middle of the triangle between New York City, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, I definitely felt surrounded. Story 24. I was in 8th grade. We had no idea what was going on. The principal popped into all the classrooms and said a tragic accident had happened, to gather our stuff and to get on our bus to go home. When I got home, I turned on the TV and watched. Story 25. I was a child, so the whole thing didn't really sink in until later. My dad was on a plane out of Jersey at that exact moment, so of course my mom was freaking out. We didn't own a TV, so we went to Circuit City to get one, so she could watch the news and find out if he was okay. It wasn't until I saw my mom absolutely lose her composure with an employee trying to upsell her a TV that it really clicked for me how serious everything was. Story 26. I lived right across the river in Jersey, where my dad managed a hardware store in Newark. I remember being a kid and all of the firefighters from other towns stopping by for equipment and gear. We ran out quickly, but my dad told them to take whatever they need and go. No payment, no time to waste, just grab it and go. I also remember that when the second plane hit, everyone was comparing September 11th to Pearl Harbor. As a final note, the positive side was every American, regardless of age, race, economic status, was united. The feeling was incredible, and I don't think we will ever experience it again in my lifetime. The feeling of being truly united and ready to kick some ass with the entire world standing with us is indescribable. Everyone wanted to pitch in and somehow do their part as an American. In the span of a day, the nation was transformed. Unfortunately, this was mismanaged, and as we all know, it seems like things have pretty much been going downhill since September 11th. The world on September 10th was so widely different and carefree versus the world on September 12th. Story 27. My grandmother was dying. The night before September 11th, my grandmother passed away, and our family gathered at home the next morning. That afternoon, around 2 p.m., I live in a different time zone. We got the news about the Twin Towers, and it was such an awful combination of close personal grief and confusion about what was going on with the world. Story 28. I wasn't in New York, but I watched it live on the news as it happened, in school. The worst part one saw was people jumping willingly to their deaths because the fires were too intense. That was chilling to see. Story 29. Knowing the second tower would collapse after watching the first tower collapse and helplessly screaming, "Get out!" at my television to all the firemen I had seen rushing in. Story 30. Evacuating Washington, D.C. I was working on 15th Street across from the White House and had just arrived at work around 8 a.m. After the second plane hit, we figured something significant was happening, and some of us decided to head home. It was a tense scene. Nobody was sure that we weren't about to be attacked with nuclear weapons, that planes would start falling everywhere, and so on. Some people wouldn't ride the metro, so they walked all the way back to Virginia. I was back in Roslyn by the time the Pentagon was hit. My wife, who worked for a major defense contractor, was stuck at work most of the day. So, when Flight 93 crashed about 20 miles from her hometown, she was also very worried. They finally let people leave around 3 p.m. The news was full of unsubstantiated rumors, wild speculation, and plenty of misinformation. We were all switching between channels, trying to get the whole picture. I had family from rural areas advising me to come there and hunker down. A lot of people left the DC area because there were rumors of further gas or biological attacks and so on. It was very tense being a Muslim or Sikh around DC, and many innocent people were harassed and abused. I had to take some work and groceries to a single coworker who was afraid to go to the store because of the abuse. I think the most memorable part for me was that the attackers did a great job pointing out how we panic and overreact in a situation like this. They controlled the narrative and we reacted just as they wanted. We self-imposed a police state in response, and suddenly a small group brought most of the world to its knees, reducing freedoms just as they intended. Story 31. There is a lot of worst. I can't say this is it, but I will share this bit of morbidity. By the time the first plane was confirmed, many people had gathered around TVs wherever they were. So by the time plane 2 hit, we were all together watching it. Then the first tower fell. Then the second. Everyone gathered together, watching this mass casualty event on TV. Not a good feeling. Not a good day. May all those souls not be forgotten.